Okay, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a really foundational idea in how we understand learning. It's one that kind of shifted psychology's focus away from, the inside of the mind towards something you could actually see and measure.
Exactly. We're talking about behaviorist theories of learning,
Right.
behaviorism. This perspective, it popped up in the early 20th century and had a really clear mission: make psychology a hard science. Uh, Basically, forget trying to interpret thoughts or feelings.
Yeah, focus on what you can actually observe. Things you can watch count.
That's it. Observable behavior.
And for this deep dive, we're drawing on an article from Self Sensei that covers this topic really well. So our goal here is to um, unpack the core behaviorist idea of learning.
Get into the main types: classical and operant conditioning.
Look at how they actually play out in the real world and also, consider their strengths and maybe where they fall short.
Yeah, the aim is really to give you a good handle on this hugely influential way of thinking about how we change, how we learn skills, and honestly, how our environment shapes us, often in ways we don't even realize.
Okay, so if it's not about thinking or feeling, how does behaviorism actually define learning? What is learning from this point of view?
Well, they define it very specifically. It's a relatively permanent change in observable behavior that comes about through experience.
Okay, observable behavior. That sounds like the absolute key phrase there.
It really is the cornerstone. Learning, for a behaviorist, isn't some abstract concept floating around in your head.
No, it's something you do.
Exactly. It's shown through actions, responses, performances, things that could be seen, recorded, measured. Think about, say, learning a musical instrument. You haven't learned it until you can play the piece. That's the observable behavior.
And the relatively permanent part, what's the significance of that? Why relative?
Well, that distinguishes real learning from just temporary changes. If you're tired or ill, or maybe even had a bit too much caffeine, your behavior might shift.
But you haven't learned anything new, fundamentally.
Right. It's not a lasting change. Learning is seen as a more durable modification in how you respond, one that's brought about by interacting with the world, not just a fleeting state.
So early behaviorism was quite strict about this then, like input, output, and don't worry about what's inside.
Very much so. It was often called the black box approach. Focus on the environmental stimulus going in and the behavioral response coming out. What happens in between thoughts, feelings, that was considered inaccessible, maybe even irrelevant, for objective science.
If you can't see it, you can't measure it scientifically. That was the idea.
Pretty much.
So what are the core beliefs behind this whole approach?
First and foremost, the environment is king. The idea is that we learn primarily by interacting with our surroundings. Stimuli trigger behaviors, and those connections are built through conditioning.
And some early figures like John B. Watson really pushed this hard, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. Watson essentially argued internal states were completely irrelevant for scientific psychology.
It sounds quite deterministic then, like our actions are just predictable results of environmental pushes and pulls.
That's definitely the leaning, yes. Behavior is viewed largely as a product of environmental inputs and an individual's conditioning history. Now later, B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism tried to incorporate internal events a bit more.
How so?
He acknowledged things like thoughts and feelings, but he saw them as private behaviors. Still behaviors, just internal ones, and still shaped by the same principles of reinforcement and punishment as our outward actions. So for Skinner, even personality or knowledge were essentially complex patterns of behavior built up through interactions with the environment.
Okay, and this leads us to the two big mechanisms behaviorists identified for how this learning actually happens: classical and operant conditioning.
Exactly. Those are the two main engines. Classical conditioning, which we mostly associate with Ivan Pavlov, is about learning through associating different stimuli. It often involves involuntary, reflexive kinds of behaviors.
As operant.
Operant conditioning, really developed by B.F. Skinner, building on earlier work by Thorndike, is all about learning from the consequences of our voluntary actions. Behaviors get stronger or weaker depending on what happens after we do them.
Right. Let's start with classical conditioning then. That's the Pavlov's dogs one, isn't it? The one that almost feels like an accidental discovery.
It really was fascinating. Pavlov was a physiologist studying digestion in dogs, specifically how much they salivated when they got food.
But he noticed something odd.
Yeah, you noticed the dogs weren't just salivating when the food arrived. They started salivating beforehand, like when they saw the lab assistant who usually brought the food, or even just heard the food cart rattling down the hall.
Things that don't naturally make you salivate.
Exactly. He called them psychic secretions initially. So He pivoted his research. He set up experiments to study this systematically. He took something neutral, something that definitely wouldn't make a dog salivate on its own, like ringing a bell.
Bell rings, dog does nothing, digestion-wise.
Correct. Then he started pairing the bell ringing with presenting food. Ring the bell, give the food. Ring the bell, give the food. Repeatedly.
And the food naturally makes them salivate.
Right, that's the key. After doing this pairing many times, he tried just ringing the bell without any food. And what happened?
The dogs salivated.
They salivated just to the sound of the bell. He'd conditioned a new reflex. Learning had occurred.
Okay, let's break down the components using that example because these terms are crucial.
Definitely. First, you have the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS. This is the thing that naturally automatically triggers a response without any learning needed.
So the food in this case.
Exactly. Or like a loud noise making you jump, or a puff of air making you blink. That's the UCS.
And the natural reaction to that is the unconditioned response, the UCR.
Yes, the unlearned reflexive reaction. The dog's salivation to the food. That's the UCR.
Then there's the neutral stimulus, the NS. The thing that starts out meaning nothing.
Like the bell before the experiment started. It doesn't cause salivation initially.
But after it's paired repeatedly with the UCS,
It stops being neutral. It becomes the conditioned stimulus, the CS. It acquires the power to trigger a response because it now predicts the UCS.
and the response it triggers is the conditioned response, the CR.
Precisely. The salivation to the bell alone. It often looks similar to the UCR, but it's learned, it's triggered by the CS. Seeing that CR emerge is the sign that classical conditioning has taken place.
So you learn this association. Does it just stick around forever once it's formed?
Not necessarily. The initial learning phase, when the CS-UCS link is being formed and strengthened, that's called acquisition. And it usually works best. The CS comes just a little bit before the UCS. That makes it a good signal. But if you then start presenting the CS, the bell, over and over again without the UCS consorus, the food that learned response, the CR, will gradually get weaker and eventually stop.
That sounds like extinction.
That's exactly what it is. The conditioned response fades away. But interestingly, it doesn't always mean the learning is totally erased.
Ah, because sometimes it can pop back up later.
Yes, that's called spontaneous recovery. After extinction seems complete, if you wait a while and then present the CS again, the CR might suddenly reappear, although usually weaker. It suggests the association was maybe suppressed rather than completely forgotten.
And what if something similar to the original stimulus triggers the response, like maybe a different sounding bell?
That's stimulus generalization. Once you've conditioned a response to a specific CS, other stimuli that are similar to it might also trigger the CR, maybe to a lesser degree.
Which could be useful, right? If you learn one snake is dangerous, you might react cautiously to similar-looking ones.
Exactly, it has adaptive value. But you can also learn the opposite to tell the difference.
Stimulus discrimination.
Right, that's the ability to differentiate between the CS that predicts the UCS and other similar stimuli that don't. So the dog learns to salivate only to the specific bell tone that was paired with food, not just any bell sound. You learn this through training where only the target CS is followed by the UCS.
Wow. It's kind of amazing how many of our sort of gut reactions or unconscious responses could be rooted in these simple associations. Where else do we see this playing out?
Oh, everywhere. Think about emotional responses. Fears, anxieties, phobias often have roots in classical conditioning. A previously neutral situation or object gets paired with a genuinely frightening or traumatic event.
And then the neutral thing starts triggering fear all on its own.
Exactly. Like a child who gets bitten by a specific dog, UCS causing fear, UCR, might develop a fear, CR, of all dogs, CS generalization. John B. Watson's infamous Little Albert experiment tried to demonstrate this, conditioning fear in an infant towards a white rat. Ethically problematic, but a stark illustration.
And advertising, they seem to be masters of using this.
Absolutely. Pairing products, the CS, with things that naturally evoke positive feelings like attractive people, beautiful scenery, humor, upbeat music. UCS says, hoping you'll start to feel good, CR. Just thinking about the product itself.
Yeah.
Associating the brand with positive vibes.
And therapy uses these principles too, right? But to sort of undo unwanted conditioning.
Yes, definitely. Exposure therapy for phobias is basically applied extinction. You gradually expose the person to the feared CS in a safe setting without the bad UCS happening, so the fear response, CR, can weaken and extinguish.
And aversion therapy kind of flips it.
It does. It tries to create a negative conditioned response to an undesirable behavior, like pairing a nausea-inducing drug, UCS, with alcohol consumption, CS, to create an aversion, CR, to alcohol.
And taste aversions, everyone's probably experienced that. Eat something new, get sick later.
And suddenly you can't stand the thought of that food, even if it wasn't actually what made you sick. It's a powerful one-trial learning usually, very adaptive for survival.
And it plays a big role in addiction too, doesn't it? Cravings and relapse.
Hugely important. Environmental cues, places, people, paraphernalia, even certain moods that were associated with past drug use, UCS, become potent CSs. They can trigger intense cravings and physiological responses, CRs, that feel like withdrawal, making relapse much more likely. Managing these conditioned triggers is a critical part of treatment.
It really shows how pervasive these learned associations are, often operating below our conscious awareness.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's classical conditioning learning by associating stimuli, often leading to automatic responses. Operant conditioning sounds quite different. It's more about what happens after you do something.
That's the core difference, yes. Operant conditioning focuses on voluntary behaviors, actions we choose to do, and how the consequences of those actions influence whether we do them again. Behaviors followed by good outcomes become more likely. Behaviors followed by bad outcomes become less likely.
And this builds on Edward Thorndike's work, right, with the cats and puzzle boxes.
Definitely. Thorndike was a key precursor. He found that cats, trying to escape these puzzle boxes, would initially perform lots of random actions. But over time, they'd start repeating the specific actions, like pulling a loop or pressing a lever that actually opened the door and let them get to food.
Because those actions led to a satisfying result.
Exactly. This led him to formulate the law of effect. Behaviors that are followed by satisfying consequences tend to be repeated or stamped in, while behaviors followed by unsatisfying consequences are less likely to be repeated or stamped out. The consequence shapes the behavior.
And B.F. Skinner took this basic idea and really built a whole systematic framework around it.
He did. Skinner wanted to study how we learn and maintain all sorts of novel voluntary behaviors. He called them operants because they operate on the environment. He developed the operant conditioning chamber, or Skinner box, which was a controlled environment.
What was special about the box?
It allowed him to precisely control the consequences delivered after an animal performed a specific action, like pressing a lever or picking a disc, and it automatically recorded the rate of that behavior. So he could systematically manipulate consequences and objectively measure the effect on behavior.
Very scientific. So
Yeah.
the core mechanisms here are reinforcement and punishment. And we need to be really careful with the terms positive and negative.
Absolutely critical. Positive simply means adding something to the situation, and negative means removing something. They don't mean good or bad in the everyday sense.
Okay, so reinforcement is anything that makes a behavior more likely to happen again.
Correct. Reinforcement strengthens behavior.
So positive reinforcement is when you add something desirable after a behavior.
Exactly. You do the behavior, you get something good, you do it more often. A student answers a question well, gets praise, add a desirable stimulus, more likely to participate. A rat presses a liver, gets a food pellet, add a desirable stimulus, presses the liver more. Get a bonus for hitting sales targets, work harder. Give your dog a treat for sitting, more likely to sit on command. It's adding something pleasant to increase behavior.
Got it. Now, negative reinforcement, this is the tricky one people often confuse with punishment, but it still increases behavior.
Yes, it does, because it involves removing something aversive or unpleasant after the behavior occurs. The behavior increases because it makes the bad thing stop or go away.
So you do the behavior to escape or avoid something nasty.
Precisely. A rat presses a lever, and an annoying loud noise stops. Aversive stimulus removed. Presses a lever more. You fasten your seatbelt, and the irritating beeping stops. Aversive stimulus removed. You reliably fasten your seatbelt. You take paracetamol, your headache goes away. Aversive stimulus removed. You take paracetamol next time you have a headache. A kid cleans their room and their parents stop nagging. Aversive stimulus removed. They clean their room to avoid the nagging. The behavior is strengthened by taking away something negative.
Okay, that distinction is really important. Both kinds of reinforcement make the behavior more likely. Now, punishment is the opposite. It makes a behavior less likely.
Correct. Punishment weakens or decreases the likelihood of a behavior recurring.
So positive punishment is when you add something aversive after a behavior.
Right. You do the behavior, something unpleasant happens, you do it less often. A child talks back, gets scolded, aversive stimulus added. Someone speeds, gets a speeding ticket, aversive stimulus added. Touch a hot stove, get burned, aversive stimulus added. The behavior decreases because an unpleasant consequence is introduced.
And negative punishment is when you remove something desirable after a behavior.
Yes, you do the behavior, something good gets taken away, you do the behavior less often. A teenager stays out past curfew, loses phone privileges, desirable stimulus removed.
Mhm.
A child throws a tantrum, loses access to their favorite toy, desirable stimulus removed. A student plagiarizes, gets kicked off the sports team, desirable stimulus removed. Taking away something pleasant makes the behavior less likely.
Okay, let's recap that quickly. Positive, add. Negative, remove. Reinforcement, increase behavior. Punishment, decrease behavior. Got it.
That's the matrix. Understanding those four is key.
And it's not just what the consequence is, but when it happens, right? The timing and frequency matter a lot. That's where the schedules of reinforcement come in.
Absolutely crucial. The schedule, the pattern of reinforcement has a massive impact on how quickly you learn a behavior, how often you perform it, and really importantly, how resistant it is to stopping, to extinction.
The simplest is
Yes.
probably getting reinforced every time.
That's continuous reinforcement. Every single time the desired behavior occurs, it gets reinforced. Think of a vending machine. You put money in, behavior. You get a snack, reinforcement, every single time.
What's the effect of that?
It leads to very fast learning, rapid acquisition. But the downside is that extinction also happens very quickly if the reinforcement stops. As soon as the machine stops paying out, you stop putting money in pretty fast.
Which is why partial or intermittent reinforcement schedules are often more powerful in the real world, right? Where you only get reinforced some of the time.
Exactly. Learning might take a bit longer, but behaviors learned this way are much more persistent. They're way more resistant to extinction. If you're used to not being rewarded every time, you'll keep trying for longer when the rewards dry up.
Makes sense. What are the main types?
There are four basic types. First, fixed ratio, FR. Reinforcement comes after a fixed, specific number of responses.
Like getting paid for every 10 widgets you make, or a loyalty card where you get a free coffee after buying 5.
Perfect examples. This tends to produce a high, steady rate of responding, often with a little pause right after getting the reinforcement before starting up again.
Okay, then variable ratio, VR.
Here, reinforcement comes after an unpredictable number of responses. It averages out over time, but you never know which response will be the one that pays off.
Like playing a slot machine. Or maybe sales calls.
Exactly. Gambling is the classic VR example. You don't know which pull will win, so you keep pulling. Salespeople on commission often face this unpredictable number of calls needed for a sale. This schedule produces the highest and most consistent rates of response, and it's incredibly resistant to extinction. That unpredictability keeps people hooked.
You can see why that's powerful and maybe a bit dangerous too.
Absolutely. Next is fixed interval, FI. Reinforcement is given for the first response that occurs after a specific, fixed amount of time has passed.
Like getting a paycheck every Friday, or studying for a test that happens at a set time.
Precisely. The paycheck comes weekly, regardless of minute-by-minute effort that week. This leads to a pattern called scalloping. People tend to do very little right after reinforcement, then increase their activity rapidly as the time for the next reinforcement approaches, like cramming before an exam.
Yeah, I recognize that pattern. Okay, last one.
Variable interval. Reinforcement is given for the first response after an unpredictable amount of time has passed. Again, it averages out, but you don't know when the window for reinforcement will open.
Like checking your email. You don't know when a new message will arrive, so you check periodically.
That's a great example. Or a supervisor who wanders around and gives praise randomly throughout the day. This tends to produce a slow, steady rate of responding because the reward could come at any time. It's also quite resistant to extinction.
Understanding these schedules really helps explain a lot about persistence, or lack thereof in different situations. But what if you want to teach a behavior that someone just never does? How do you even start reinforcing it?
That's where shaping comes in. It's also called the method of successive approximations. It's how you build up a complex behavior step by step.
How does it work?
You start by reinforcing any behavior that is even remotely close to your final target behavior. Then, once that's happening more often, you only reinforce behaviors that are a little bit closer, then closer still. You gradually raise the bar, reinforcing successive approximations until the organism is performing the full, complex behavior you wanted.
Like teaching a rat to press a lever. First reward just going near the lever, then touching it, then finally pressing it.
Exactly that process. Skinner famously used shaping to teach pigeons to do amazing things, like play ping pong or turn in circles. It's fundamental to animal training and also how we teach many human skills, like tying shoelaces or learning a golf swing. You reinforce small improvements along the way.
And like classical conditioning, can operantly conditioned behaviors also extinguish?
Yes, definitely. If a behavior that was previously reinforced stops producing that reinforcement, its frequency will gradually decrease. It undergoes extinction.
And does the schedule matter here too?
Hugely. Extinction happens much faster after continuous reinforcement. Behaviors learned on partial schedules, especially those variable ones, VR and 6, are much more resistant to extinction. You might also see an extinction burst. Initially, a temporary increase in the behavior as the individual tries harder to get the reward, or they might try other related behaviors.
Okay. The applications of operant conditioning seem incredibly broad. Where else do we see it used systematically?
Well, education is a huge one. Classroom management often uses operant principles. Think token economies, sticker charts, praise for participation. Even instructional design borrows from it, breaking complex tasks into smaller steps, providing immediate feedback. Early teaching machines were based entirely on these ideas.
And in therapy.
Absolutely central to behavior therapy or behavior modification. Applied behavior analysis, or ABA, is a whole field dedicated to systematically applying operant principles to produce socially significant behavior change. It's very widely used, for example, in helping individuals with autism develop communication and social skills.
Are there specific techniques?
Loads. Things like contingency management, where you provide tangible rewards for desired behaviors, like staying drug-free in substance abuse treatment. Or functional behavior assessment, which tries to figure out the specific triggers and reinforcers that are maintaining a problem behavior so you can change them.
And animal training, that seems like a really obvious fit.
It's the bedrock of modern humane animal training. Positive reinforcement using treats, praise, toys combined with shaping is how most professionals train everything from pets to service animals to zoo animals cooperating with vet care. It's far more effective and less stressful than older punishment-based methods.
Makes sense. What about the workplace?
All over the place.
Yeah.
Performance bonuses, sales commissions, promotions, employee recognition programs, even simple praise from a manager. These are all designed as positive reinforcement to motivate desired behaviors like productivity, meeting targets, or following safety procedures.
But is there a potential downside to relying so heavily on these external rewards? Does it affect intrinsic motivation?
That's a very important critique, yes. The whole extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation issue. If you reward someone for doing something they already enjoy, sometimes it can actually undermine their internal interest. They start doing it for the reward, not the enjoyment. And if the reward stops...
The behavior might stop too, even if they used to like doing it.
Exactly. It suggests that applying operant principles, especially with rewards, needs to be done thoughtfully, considering the person's existing motivations. It's not always straightforward.
So behaviorism gives us these powerful tools for understanding how specific actions are learned and changed by the environment. What kind of overall picture does it paint of the learner then?
Well, because the focus is so heavily on environmental stimuli and consequences shaping behavior, it naturally leads to a view where the environment is the primary driver.
Bringing us back to that idea of determinism we touched on earlier.
To a large extent, yes, especially in the stricter forms of behaviorism. Actions are seen as being largely determined by your past conditioning and the current situation, which leaves less emphasis on internal things like free will or conscious choice.
You mentioned Watson's quote about being able to train any infant.
Right. His claim that he could take any healthy infant and, given control over the environment, train them to become any kind of specialist, doctor, lawyer, artist, even thief, regardless of their innate talents or tendencies. It's an extreme statement, but it highlights the immense power attributed to environmental conditioning.
And how does the learner fit into this picture? Are they active or passive?
Traditionally, behaviorism often portrays the learner as somewhat passive, kind of like a blank slate or tabula rasa, onto which experiences are written by the environment through conditioning.
So knowledge isn't something you actively construct. It's more like it's delivered to you.
That's often the implication. The teacher or the environment manages the stimuli and consequences, and the learner responds. Their prior knowledge, internal goals, or personal interests are seen as less critical than the external contingencies.
And that passive learner idea has definitely drawn a lot of criticism over the years, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Huge criticism, especially from cognitive psychology, which really emphasizes our internal mental processes and active construction of knowledge.
What are the main issues people raise?
Critics argue it's an oversimplification, that it neglects the learner's own agency, initiative, curiosity, and the drive we have to actively make sense of things. It can feel a bit mechanistic when you try to explain complex human thinking, like insight or creative problem solving.
There seems to be a bit of a paradox there, too.
How so?
Well, if you use behaviorist techniques for very tight control to teach specific skills, does that limit the chance for, independent thinking, exploring, figuring things out for yourself, higher order skills?
That's a valid concern. While effective for drilling specific facts or procedures, an over-reliance on purely behavioral methods might not foster the deeper conceptual understanding, critical analysis, or metacognitive skills thinking about your own learning that are needed for true adaptability and knowledge transfer.
Okay, so let's try and pull it all together. Evaluating behaviorism overall, what are its biggest, most undeniable contributions?
I say two main things stand out. First, its push for scientific rigor and objectivity. By insisting on studying observable, measurable behavior, it was absolutely critical in moving psychology towards being a more empirical science, away from purely subjective methods.
That's a huge legacy.
Huge. And second, the development of practical applications and therapeutic techniques. Behaviorism gave us concrete tools: ABA, exposure therapy, token economies, systematic animal training methods that have proven genuinely effective for changing behavior in many real-world settings.
And it did map out those fundamental learning mechanisms.
Classical and operant conditioning. Even if we now understand them as part of a bigger picture, they remain core concepts for understanding how behaviors are learned and changed.
But then there are the significant criticisms, the things it arguably misses or gets wrong.
The biggest one is probably the neglect of cognitive processes. Ignoring or downplaying thoughts, beliefs, expectations, motivation, that internal world just feels incomplete for explaining complex human experience. This was the main trigger for the cognitive revolution in psychology.
And it struggles with certain complex behaviors.
Yes, things like language development. Noam Chomsky's critique of Skinner's views on language was very influential. Also, creativity, insight learning, complex problem solving. These often seem to involve more than just stimulus-response links or reinforcement history.
Plus the passive learner model we just discussed.
Right. That view is widely seen as inadequate now, contrasting sharply with modern views of learners as active constructors of knowledge. And we can't ignore the ethical concerns, especially around the use of punishment, which can have unintended negative side effects like fear, anxiety, or aggression, and potential issues around manipulation or control.
So where does that leave behaviorism today? Is it just a historical curiosity?
Not at all. While it's not the dominant grand theory it once aimed to be, its principles are still incredibly relevant and have been integrated into broader frameworks.
Like how?
Think about social learning theory, Albert Bandura's work. He incorporated observational learning by watching others, and cognitive factors like self-efficacy and expectations, effectively bridging behaviorism and cognitive psychology.
And therapy.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is probably the most prominent example. It's one of the most effective and widely used forms of psychotherapy today, and it explicitly combines behavioral techniques like exposure or activity scheduling with cognitive techniques aimed at changing maladaptive thought patterns. It acknowledges both behavior and internal states matter.
Even Skinner's radical behaviorism tried to account for internal events, but maybe didn't fully satisfy critics about their causal role.
Exactly. The key takeaway, I think, is that while behaviorism as an all-encompassing theory of learning has its limitations, its principles and techniques remain incredibly powerful tools in specific contexts where changing observable behavior is the primary goal.
So its strength is really in its practical application, its behavioral engineering toolkit.
Precisely. For things like skills training in ABA, animal training, managing specific classroom issues, modifying simple habits, the principles are robust and effective.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into behaviorist theories,
Let's recap. The core definition. Learning is that relatively permanent change in observable behavior due to experience.
driven by two main mechanisms: classical conditioning learning through association, often automatic responses.
And operant conditioning, learning from the consequences of our voluntary actions, reinforcement, and punishment.
And we've seen these have undeniable practical uses in education, therapy, animal training, and more.
Behaviorism's big legacy includes its emphasis on empirical science and the undeniable influence of the environment.
While acknowledging its limitations, especially regarding cognition and the passive view of the learner.
And today, these principles are often part of a more integrated understanding of learning, combined with cognitive and other perspectives.
So behaviorism isn't the whole story of learning.
Definitely not. but it laid absolutely crucial groundwork for studying learning scientifically, gave us invaluable concepts and vocabulary, and provides a really powerful toolkit for understanding and influencing behavior in specific situations. It's still an essential piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. We've gone from Pavlov's dogs ringing bells, metaphorically speaking, and Skinner's rats in boxes, to seeing how these ideas might echo in, well, everything from phobias you might have to how ads try to sway you, the way skills are taught, even how your dog learned to fetch. These principles are often working quietly in the background of your life.
Yeah, and it leaves us with a really interesting, maybe slightly unsettling thought to ponder. If our behavior is so heavily shaped by these environmental consequences, these learned associations, this constant conditioning, well, how much of what we consider us, our choices, our actions, is truly down to free will? And how much is, perhaps, just a very complex, learned response to the world firing stimuli at us?
Something to definitely think about next time you react automatically to something, or find yourself chasing a reward or avoiding a task. Is it conscious choice, or is it conditioning at work?